Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the desert, where the air feels still and heavy, where the sand seems to hum when the wind picks up, and where stories are spoken in a language that sounds both sharp and melodic at the same time. You might not realize it, but those whispers you imagine drifting across the mesas once carried the fate of entire armies. And here's the funny reality check. If someone dropped you right into the middle of the Navajo reservation without Google Translate or a Navajo grandma to guide you, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in conversation, let alone survive decoding a war message. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward into the desert twilight, where colours stretch like a painter's brush, orange bleeding into purple, then fading into blue as stars take their places. This land belongs to the Navajo people, who call themselves the Diné, the people. Their voices carry across canyons, words shaped by centuries, words that outsiders once dismissed as strange or impenetrable. But here, each syllable is alive, every pause has weight, even silence feels full. As you walk, you realize language here isn't just a way to pass information, it's an art form, a vessel, a living history. Children once sat around fires as elders told stories not meant for paper but meant for the ear, the heart, and the memory. You imagine yourself sitting cross-legged in that firelight, smoke rising in spirals, hearing tales that never needed ink to survive. This oral world feels different from the one you know, where text messages vanish into digital ether. Here, nothing vanishes unless someone forgets to speak it. A mainstream fact sneaks in. Before World War II, anthropologists recorded that Navajo was so complex that only a handful of non-Navajo could understand it fluently, and none could speak it well. It had tones, breathy nuances, verbs that could twist into hundreds of forms. If English is a toolbox, Navajo is a warehouse filled with drawers you'll never finish opening. And because of that complexity, some outsiders whispered that it wasn't just a language, it was a fortress. Your sandals crunch against dry stone, and you catch yourself smiling at a quirky tidbit. Early missionaries once tried to put the language into writing but gave up, calling it unspelled, unspellable. Imagine trying to alphabetize a song sung in shifting pitches while someone drums in the background. Not easy. And historians still argue whether the Navajo's oral strength was born from isolation on their reservation, or from deliberate cultural preservation in the face of colonial pressure. Either way, it left them with something unique, a living key no outsider could copy. As the stars sharpen above you, coyotes yelp in the distance. You feel like you're trespassing in time. The same wind brushing your cheek once brushed against men who would later sit in foxholes halfway across the world, speaking this very tongue into crackling radios. At that moment, no one around them, no general, no enemy, no scientist with a chalkboard full of code, could break in. Only those born into this world of sound could ride its currents. You pause at a sandstone cliff, its surface etched with petroglyphs, stick figures, spirals, hunting scenes. These aren't writing the way you know it, but they feel like an ancestor to the stories whispered at night. You can almost hear an elder's voice. The spiral means a journey. The spiral means you. Your eyes trace the lines, and you wonder how much meaning you're missing. Outsiders often miss more than they know. The desert night cools. A breeze shifts the sagebrush, filling the air with a faint sharpness. You imagine soldiers decades later clutching field radios, hunched over in fear, yet speaking this same language with calm precision. You realize those future whispers had their roots right here, in this silence, in these stars, in this breath. The war hadn't come yet, but the seeds were already planted, and then you catch yourself with a small joke. If someone back then had asked you to invent an unbreakable military code, you'd probably just have suggested Pig Latin. Not quite the same, is it? Your path leads downward into a shallow canyon. The walls rise around you, echoing your footsteps. Every sound bounces back softer, like the canyon itself is trying to hush you. You feel wrapped in quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your heartbeat. It's easy to imagine the first Navajo words being spoken here, bouncing, layering, finding rhythm with the rocks. This is the entry point to the story, the whispered foundation, the desert stage where language became a power no one expected. You can almost feel the next chapters approaching, storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. But for now, you sit against the canyon wall, looking up at the night sky, waiting for the first hints of that storm. You wake the next morning with the sun glaring off sandstone, heat already gathering even though dawn is barely finished stretching. Your throat feels dry, your eyes blink against the brightness, and you remember this is a place where memory lives in words, not in books. The elders of the Navajo didn't carry libraries strapped to their backs. They carried the stories in their voices, and those voices stretched across generations like invisible bridges. You shuffle forward on dusty trails and picture yourself as a child here centuries ago. You'd sit cross-legged in a hogan, a traditional home made of logs and packed earth, and wait for the old stories to begin. Your grandmother's voice would slide low, then rise high, sometimes whispering, sometimes chanting, always alive. You wouldn't be scribbling notes in a notebook. You'd be leaning in, repeating certain phrases quietly to yourself until they stuck. Memory wasn't optional, it was survival. And here's a mainstream fact to anchor you. Anthropologists recorded that many Navajo stories were hundreds of lines long, involving dozens of characters, and were performed with astonishing accuracy year after year. Compare that with how quickly most of us forget what we had for lunch yesterday. If you had to perform an entire story of the hero twins without skipping a beat, you'd be sweating bullets halfway through. But it wasn't just myth. Oral memory handled everything: medicine, weather signs, clan histories, even migration routes. It was a woven map where forgetting meant losing more than a story. It meant losing identity. The Navajo didn't see language as separate from life. It was life. You pause at a shallow stream. The water barely trickles, but the sound pulls you in. Imagine being told. The stream speaks. Listen. It's not metaphorical fluff. It's how a Navajo child might be guided to see the world. Words here are less about dictionary definitions and more about relationships. The stream is part of your story, just as you are part of it. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you smirk. Early American school teachers on reservations tried to ban Navajo children from speaking their language. They believed English was the future. Kids were punished for whispering in Navajo at recess. Yet, decades later, that same forbidden tongue would become the most secure communication system of World War II. You can't help but laugh at the irony, like telling someone to throw away a rusty key, only to discover later it opens the one vault no thief could crack. Historians still argue whether those bans slowed the language's spread or unintentionally forced the Navajo community to treasure it even more tightly. After all, what you're told to hide, you sometimes hide best. As you wander, You find yourself inside another hogan, this time imagined. The smoke from a fire curls lazily through a small hole in the roof. Around you sit children leaning against earthen walls, listening. A story begins, not short, not snappy, but unfolding like a slow-blooming flower. The elder speaks of changing woman, of monsters chased across mesas, of sacred mountains you can almost see if you close your eyes. The cadence is hypnotic, much like the kind you're listening to now. You lean in, lulled by repetition. Certain phrases repeat again and again, like a chorus designed to drill itself into your skull. The strategy is genius. Where writing needs ink, oral tradition needs rhythm. And the Navajo mastered rhythm the way we master playlists. A small joke crosses your mind. Try to memorize your entire Wi-Fi password and you'll probably mess up at the 5th character. Here, a child could memorize hundreds of lines about coyote stealing fire and recite it decades later without a glitch. Who's the real memory champion? You step back into the sunlit desert and your thoughts drift forward in time. You know where this story's going. These same oral techniques will one day let young men memorize entire coded dictionaries of war terms without ever writing them down. Marines will carry radios, bullets, and rations, but no code books. The code itself will live only in their tongues, just as stories did for centuries. For now, though, you stay in this earlier world, where language is sacred. You imagine a young boy looking at the stars and learning which ones mark planting season. He's not told once, he's told again and again until the star pattern burns into him. Later, as a man, he'll tell it to his son. This cycle is older than the United States, older than the maps in your pocket. The desert wind picks up, carrying with it a faint whistle that sounds like laughter. Maybe it's just the rocks, maybe it's the ancestors. You half expect to hear an elder say, "Don't forget this, don't lose it." You feel the weight of that warning, and as you keep walking you realize that what felt like just whispers in the desert are, in fact, the building blocks of an unbreakable code, not yet drafted, not yet sharpened, but waiting. The foundation is already here. Centuries before a world war will come begging for help. You shake your head with a quiet grin. The generals who would later stumble on this solution had no idea they were about to depend on bedtime stories, clan histories, and monster tales. Sometimes, the strongest armor isn't forged in steel. Sometimes, it's whispered across firelight and carried in memory. You trudge forward, and the desert begins to dissolve. Sand and mesas blur into city streets, newsprint headlines, and radios humming with static. The world shifts from quiet oral tradition into the roaring chaos of the 1940s. You hear engines droning overhead, typewriters clattering, and the low voice of a president reminding his people that the world is at war. You're standing in the storm that swallowed the planet. World War II. It's not just Europe's burning cities you sense. It's also the Pacific, vast and dotted with islands you can barely pronounce. Pearl Harbor's smoke still lingers in the air, and across the United States, panic and determination intertwine. Military leaders wrestle with an invisible but very real problem: communication. How do you shout across oceans without letting your enemies listen in? Here's your mainstream fact. Throughout the early war years, US and Allied forces used mechanical and mathematical ciphers to send messages. Think of them like giant puzzle boxes, complex, clever, but ultimately crackable. The Japanese codebreakers proved it by deciphering American transmissions more than once. Soldiers died because someone, somewhere, had the patience to crunch numbers faster than the intended recipients could act. You stroll through a war room, maps pinned to walls, strings stretching from island to island. Generals lean over the table, brows furrowed. They need a code that's quick, flexible, and unbreakable. Something living, something beyond machines. You can almost hear one of them mutter, "We need a miracle." Meanwhile, in the background, another piece of the storm churns. A small group of Native Americans are enlisting, some drafted, some volunteering, many not even recognized fully as citizens under American law at the time. Imagine signing up to fight for a country that still hesitates to acknowledge you as equal. It's the kind of irony history seems addicted to. The scene shifts. You're on a noisy dock in California, ships creaking, soldiers loading crates. You notice a quirky tidbit tucked between the chaos. Some military leaders actually toyed with using other Native American languages for code. Choctaw had been used in World War I with modest success. But Navajo? At first, it was seen as too complex, too isolated, too unwieldy, too much trouble. Yet trouble sometimes becomes treasure. Historians still argue whether the push for Navajo came from sheer desperation or from one particularly persistent civilian, Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran who grew up on the Navajo reservation and spoke their language. He believed Navajo might be the key, and he marched into Marine Corps offices insisting on it. Some say without him, the entire idea would have died in the too difficult pile. Others claim the military would have eventually stumbled into it anyway. Either way, you picture Johnston like that one friend in a group chat who won't stop spamming an idea until everyone finally caves. The war tightens around you. You hear distant gunfire, the drone of Japanese Zero planes, the thrum of radios coughing static. Messages fly back and forth, but too often, the wrong ears catch them. American troops pay the price. The demand for something new becomes louder with every lost battle. You catch yourself smiling wryly. If modern generals face the same issue, they probably suggest switching to emojis. Send reinforcements becomes SOS, not exactly secure. Instead, the solution will come from a desert tongue most outsiders can't even pronounce. At this point in your walk through history, you don't see the code talkers yet. They're still at home, still herding sheep, still sitting in classrooms where English dominates and Navajo is whispered in secret. But the storm is circling closer. The Marines are about to knock on their doors. You take a deep breath. The war feels heavy, like a humid blanket. Everywhere you look, there's urgency. Scientists scribble formulas. Cryptographers slam fists against cipher wheels. Generals bark into phones. And in the middle of it all, somewhere quiet, sits a language that has survived centuries of suppression. A language built on oral memory, on rhythm, on patterns of thought most outsiders never bothered to learn. The stage is set. You're walking along its edge, hearing the drums of war, waiting for someone to realize that the answer isn't more machines or more math. It's a whisper, a word, a sound carried from desert fires to foxholes. The storm of world war has swallowed you whole now. The noise, the maps, the smoke, the desperation. You know the next step. Someone is about to suggest the impossible. Someone is about to say, "What if we use Navajo?" The room is thick with cigarette smoke, typewriters clicking like teeth, and the low hum of radios that never quite go silent. You're standing just behind a Marine officer who scratches his head, staring at scribbled notes. Across the table sits Philip Johnston, the stubborn World War I veteran who refuses to let his idea die. He's explaining, again, how Navajo could work as a code. You lean in as he describes the language. No written form, no universal dictionary, spoken fluently by maybe 30 non-Navajo people in the entire world. Your ears perk up. You don't have to be a cryptographer to see the appeal. It's like being handed a lock with no keyholes at all. Here's your mainstream fact. In 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps actually ran a pilot test at Camp Elliott, California. 4 Navajo speakers were asked to send and receive messages in their language while a room full of code experts tried to break it. The verdict? Messages that took other codes half an hour to scramble could be sent and understood in less than 20 seconds. The generals were sold. But you're not a general. You're just a sleepy wanderer in this story. So you imagine the sound of those test messages, Navajo words bouncing through radios, clipped and sharp, baffling to outsiders. Even the translators brought in to try couldn't keep up. A quirky tidbit makes you grin. One general reportedly compared listening to Navajo to trying to untangle a bird's nest by ear. That's about as flattering as military compliments get. Historians still argue whether Navajo's success was due purely to its linguistic complexity, or to the fact that the Axis powers had almost no access to Navajo speakers to even begin cracking it. After all, there were no exchange students in Berlin chatting about sheep herding terms in Dinebizard. Some scholars claim it was the isolation that made it safe. Others insist it was the language's internal structure itself. The debate lingers like static on an old radio. You close your eyes and hear the tones, syllables with rising and falling pitches, words changing meaning depending on a tiny shift in voice. In English, sheep is always sheep. In Navajo, you might need a verb form that describes exactly how the sheep is moving, standing or lying down. Outsiders didn't even know where to start. You walk into a scene, a Navajo family in their hogan at dusk, unaware that the words they trade casually across the fire will soon travel oceans. A grandmother calls out to a child in Navajo, simple, ordinary, every day. But if a Japanese cryptographer were listening, it might as well be Martian. You grin at the thought if aliens ever show up, forget binary or math. Just hand them a Navajo phrasebook and watch them panic. Meanwhile, the Marines begin planning. Johnston convinces them to recruit 24 Navajo men to develop a system. You picture the first recruiters driving onto the reservation in jeeps, dust trailing behind. They find teenagers and young men tending sheep, walking home from school, standing on basketball courts. You want to join the Marines, they ask. No explanation yet about the code. Just uniforms, training, secrecy. The young men agree. Some out of duty, some out of adventure. Some because jobs are scarce and war feels inevitable. What they don't know yet is that they're about to reshape modern cryptography using the oldest tools they already carry: memory, rhythm, voice. As you walk further, you realize you're in 2 worlds at once. On one side, war rooms filled with maps, officers desperate for solutions. On the other, a reservation where families sit under starlight, speaking words no outsider understands. The 2 worlds are about to collide in the most unlikely partnership imaginable. And here comes your small joke for the road. Somewhere out there, a codebreaker was hunched over his desk, scribbling formulas, sweating bullets, while the actual unbreakable code was just a grandmother telling her grandson to come in before dark. The secret is no longer just whispering in the desert. It's about to be carried into boot camps, onto transport ships, into foxholes where lives depend on the next word spoken. You can hear it already, rising faintly through static, an ancient language woven into the heart of modern war. You shuffle forward into the dusty barracks of 1942, where the smell of leather boots and disinfectant clings to the air. Rows of bunks squeak under restless soldiers, and the sound of shouted orders rattles the thin walls. This is Camp Pendleton, California, where the unlikely recruits have just arrived. They are young Navajo men, most barely out of high school, some not yet 20, pulled from their families and ceremonies into the thunder of the military life. You glance at their faces. Some look eager, shoulders squared. Others stare wide-eyed, as though still half in the sheep fields they left behind. None of them can explain, not even to their parents, what exactly they've been recruited for. Secrecy wraps around them like a second uniform. Don't tell anyone what you're doing, the officers instruct. Even letters home must be bland, stripped of detail. Families will spend years not knowing what their sons are actually doing overseas. Here's your mainstream fact. The first group of 29 Navajo recruits were sworn into the Marines in May 1942. They would become known as the original Code Talkers. Each had to pass the same boot camp as every other Marine. Rifle drills, obstacle courses, discipline under the blazing California sun. No exemptions, no easy path. They were Marines first, linguists second. But you're not here for rifle drills. You're here for whispers. Imagine the officers pulling these men aside after training, herding them into small rooms and handing them a near impossible task. Build us a code. Fast. The men glance at each other, unsure whether to laugh or salute. They're told to turn their everyday language into a weapon, to bend centuries of oral tradition into a system of war. A quirky tidbit bubbles up. Many of the recruits were so unused to city noise that the blare of car horns and radios near the base overwhelmed them. One man later joked that the Marines taught him to march in step, but never how to sleep through Los Angeles traffic. You smirk, because even an unbreakable code can't fight honking horns. Historians still argue whether the young men realized, at that moment, how critical their work would become. Some say they were told plainly, "You'll help win the war." Others believe the weight only hit them later, when their code was used in battle. What's certain is that secrecy prevented them from fully grasping the scale at the time. They were, in their own words, just doing a job. You stand at the edge of the drill field, watching them march in formation. Boots thud in rhythm, rifles glint under the sun, yet beneath the surface, something else is forming, an invisible network of words. The Navajo language, which once flowed in canyon echoes and firelit stories, is now being sharpened into commands. Attack, retreat, flank left. The transformation feels surreal, like painting camouflage on a sacred song. And you can't resist a little joke. Somewhere, a Marine sergeant is shouting, "Drop and give me 20," while a Navajo recruit mutters under his breath in Dine Bizad. Probably something unflattering about the sergeant's haircut. Luckily for him, no one else can understand. At night, the men gather quietly, sketching out ideas on scraps of paper before destroying them. They invent substitutions, associations, and sound patterns. A plane might become jaybird, a battleship becomes whale. The code must be fast, flexible, and above all, memorable. Memory is their strongest weapon. No written manuals are allowed. If anyone forgets, the system crumbles. You can almost hear the murmurs, voices testing new phrases, rolling syllables in their mouths like stones polished by a river. The barracks hum with the birth of something extraordinary. Outside, the larger base continues its rhythm. Bugles at dawn, marches, rifle practice, chow lines. The Navajo recruits blend in, indistinguishable in their uniforms, but carrying a secret heavier than their rifles. They are not just Marines. They are builders of a code no enemy will ever break. You let yourself linger on one more image. A young man writing a letter home, saying only, "I am well. Training is hard." His mother reads it by lamplight, unaware that her son is shaping the very code that will one day turn battles in the Pacific. She tucks the letter away, proud but puzzled. The silence between what is written and what is lived grows wider. That silence is part of the story too. It will follow these men for decades, but for now they are here, drilling by day, whispering by night, caught between tradition and duty, between home and war. The recruits have arrived, the code is being born, the secret is alive. You march alongside them now, boots pounding against the chalky earth of Camp Pendleton. The sun hammers down and sweat stings your eyes, but the drill instructor doesn't care. Move faster, Marines, he bellows, voice raw from endless repetition. You glance sideways at the Navajo recruits, 29 men carrying a weight heavier than their rifles. They're not just learning how to fight, they're shaping words into weapons, building a code where silence itself must be guarded. By day, they crawl through obstacle courses, sling grenades, and clean rifles until they shine. By night, in cramped rooms lit by dim bulbs, they whisper. Their voices are low, almost conspiratorial. Words that once belonged to ceremonies and stories now bend into sharp new meanings. Sheep turns into destroyer, tortoise becomes tank, hawk transforms into dive bomber. The code is forming one syllable at a time, as if the desert itself has been smuggled into these barracks. Here's your mainstream fact. The code talkers didn't just translate English into Navajo, they invented a two-step system. Each English letter was assigned a Navajo word, like ant for A, bear for B, cat for C. They also created Navajo terms for military equipment, often using animals or natural objects. This double layer made the code not only fast but impenetrable. You listen as one recruit tests the system, radio in hand. He barks a sentence in Navajo, his voice rapid, confident. Another man on the receiving end translates it back into flawless English within seconds. Officers shake their heads in disbelief. Something that took hours with cipher machines is now done in heartbeats. Still, secrecy clamps down like a vice. No one outside these rooms can know what is being built. Even the recruits' bunkmates, just fellow Marines, assume they're just running odd language drills. If any scrap of paper survives, it must be destroyed, burned, swallowed if necessary. Memory alone is allowed. And here's a quirky tidbit. One Marine officer, curious about the Navajo practice sessions, tried to eavesdrop once. He leaned in, ears straining, but quickly gave up, muttering that it sounded like a room full of owls gossiping. The Navajo men just smiled and kept talking. Historians still argue whether the success of the training came from the Marines' strict secrecy or from the recruits' cultural tradition of oral learning. After all, these men grew up memorizing songs and stories line by line. No paper, no pencils, just memory. Was it military discipline that made them efficient? Or centuries of storytelling habits? Maybe both. You wander past the barracks into the night air. The base has quieted, save for the distant clink of boots and the murmur of waves on the California coast. You catch the recruits huddled under a lantern, perfecting their phrases. One man recites the alphabet system, eyes closed, every substitution sharp in his memory. Another rattles off terms for planes and ships like a prayer. You can't resist a small joke. If someone asked you to memorize 400 code words, you'd probably write them on sticky notes and lose them by lunch. These men memorized them cold, carried them into battle, and never slipped. Not once. A breeze rustles the papers they've been scribbling on. They snatch them up quickly and toss them into a fire barrel. Flames lick the night sky, devouring the evidence. Tomorrow, only their voices will carry the code. Back inside, The drill sergeant passes through, nodding at the men without asking questions. Maybe he suspects something big is brewing. Maybe he doesn't. Either way, the Navajo stay silent. Silence is part of their oath now. The tension is thick, but so is the pride. You see it in their eyes. A flicker of knowing they're part of something larger than themselves. A secret. Yes, but also a legacy. As the camp finally drifts towards sleep, you hear a faint hum from the men, like the low rhythm of a song. It's not in any manual, not on any radio, just their way of remembering together. The night carries it out over the Pacific, as though testing how far their voices can travel. The training is complete, the silence is secure, the code is ready to step into war. You're aboard a transport ship now, the floor vibrating beneath your boots as diesel engines churn the Pacific into froth. The Navajo Code Talkers sit nearby, huddled with their radios like monks with sacred scrolls. Their eyes are sharp, their expressions calm. But you can feel the current of tension crackling through the air. They've trained for months in secrecy, and now the code must breathe in the chaos of real combat. The first test comes during the landings at Guadalcanal. The beaches are hell, palm trees shredded into toothpicks by artillery, sand sprayed up in fountains of fire, men diving for cover as machine guns chatter. Orders must move faster than bullets. Radios buzz, operators fumble with ciphers, time slips away. But when a Navajo code talker speaks, his voice cuts through the static. Swift, measured, unbreakable. Within seconds, the message is relayed and executed. A unit pinned down on the beach advances. Supplies find their way to the front. Lives are saved. Here's your mainstream fact. The Navajo Code was never broken by the Japanese. Not once. Enemy cryptographers recorded hours of transmissions, tried to dissect the strange syllables, even brought in captured Navajo speakers from the civilian world. But the two-step system, substitution alphabet plus military terminology, was so airtight that even a fluent Navajo speaker couldn't make sense of it without the training. The code remained an enigma, a wall of sound that the enemy could only listen to, powerless. And here's a quirky tidbit. One Japanese intelligence officer reportedly called the Navajo messages a language spoken by birds. He meant it as an insult, but in a strange way, it was accurate. The messages darted and swooped, light and untouchable, like sparrows weaving through gunfire. From your vantage point, crouched in a foxhole beside a code talker, you notice something uncanny. While other Marines fumble with papers and clunky cipher wheels, the Navajo men rely solely on memory. One code talker, barely 20 years old, rattles off a string of terms for tanks, planes, and artillery without hesitation. His partner translates back into English instantly. It feels less like a military operation and more like listening to musicians improvise. Smooth, seamless, almost elegant in its speed. The officers take notice. Soon, commanders demand code talkers at every level. Battalion, regiment, division. Messages that once took hours now take minutes, even seconds. A general grumbles that his staff officers are obsolete. Another shakes his head and mutters, "This is witchcraft." You can't help but think, it does look a little like magic. Two men speaking softly in the midst of chaos. Their voices calm while mortars thunder and bullets snap overhead. Radios crackle, orders fly, and somehow the rhythm holds. Historians later debate whether the success of the Guadalcanal campaign hinged on logistics, air superiority, or pure grit. But tucked between those pages lies the quiet truth. Without rapid, secure communication, the Marines might have been swallowed whole by confusion. The Navajo voices stitch the battlefield together, thread by thread. At night, when the gunfire dies down, you sit with them under a tarp, the smell of damp jungle clinging to everything. One code talker sharpens his knife, another cleans his rifle, but they still murmur code phrases to one another. Practice. Always practice. You hear them laughing softly when someone stumbles over a word, the sound strangely light in this world of mud and fear. You think about it. Back home, these same men weren't even allowed to vote in some states. Here, their voices command divisions, redirect artillery, shift the tide of war. The irony is sharp enough to taste. The night presses in, thick with insects and humidity. Somewhere in the distance, a flare hisses into the sky, painting the jungle silver for an instant before dying out. The code talkers sit silently now, alert, radios at their sides. Their eyes scan the darkness as if listening for something beyond the jungle. Tomorrow will bring another landing, another storm of fire, but tonight, in this brief lull, the secret language rests in their throats, waiting. And you realize you're not just watching soldiers. You're watching men who have turned memory, culture, and secrecy into weapons sharper than steel. The war moves northward, island by island, and you move with it. By now, the presence of Navajo Code Talkers has become a quiet constant, like the pulse of the battlefield, always steady, always reliable. On Bougainville, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, wherever the Marines go, the radios hum with their voices. You're aboard a Higgins boat now, waves slapping the hull as Marines brace for another beach landing. The sergeant barks orders, men check their weapons, helmets rattle in the cramped space. Amidst the noise, one Navajo code talker adjusts his headset. Calm as a man preparing for church. The ramp drops, chaos explodes, and the first words into the headset are in Navajo, a chain of syllables firing off like rapid gunfire. Here's your grounded fact. During the assault on Iwo Jima, 6 code talkers working in pairs sent and received over 800 messages in the first 48 hours. Not one mistake was made. Messages about troop movements, artillery placements, supply drops, and reinforcements all shot across the island faster than any enemy could hope to react. Commanders later called their performance the difference between victory and disaster. And here's the quirky side. Marines sometimes called the code talkers the guys with magic radios. To the untrained ear, their transmissions sounded like chanting, a ritual intoned over static. Some Marines swore the code talkers' voices carried better through the noise, as if the words themselves had more weight. On Saipan, you crouch in the ruins of a sugar mill as Japanese artillery pounds the beachhead. Dust rains down, the ground trembles, and messages need to fly before the next barrage lands. You watch as a Navajo man, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his face, leans into his radio and fires off a string of code. His partner listens, translates, and replies without pause. It's faster than scribbling on paper, faster than shouting down a trench. The fire mission goes through. The Marine artillery answers back, and within minutes the enemy guns fall silent. To your left, a young private shakes his head in disbelief. It's like they got the whole war memorized, he mutters. And maybe he's not far off. The code talkers carry the battlefield in their heads. Every weapon, every unit, every strategy mapped into Navajo. They've become walking, breathing code books, living archives that can't be stolen or destroyed. At night, under the cover of palm fronds, you share rations with them. They joke about the strange canned food, spam, powdered eggs, coffee thick enough to float a spoon. One of them, with a grin, calls spam Navajo steak. Another tries to teach you a few words of the code, and you quickly realize how impossible it would be for an outsider to keep up. The logic is there, but the rhythm, the way the language bends and flows, feels like water slipping through your fingers. Mainstream historians often emphasize the landing craft, the flamethrowers, the tanks grinding across coral sand. But sitting here, watching the Code Talkers work, you realize something quieter. Wars aren't just fought with steel and fire. They're fought with time, with who can move faster, who can think clearer, who can speak and be understood before the enemy knows what hit them. And time, in these islands, belongs to the Navajo. A memory drifts back to you, something one Marine officer said after Saipan. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. That's not propaganda. That's a man counting the cost of silence, weighing it against the gift of voices no enemy could unravel. As the night deepens, you lie awake under the stars, the jungle pulsing with distant gunfire and insect songs. The Code Talkers whisper among themselves, reviewing phrases, repeating drills even in exhaustion. They're building muscle memory in the dark, their language becoming sharper, faster, more automatic with every repetition. It occurs to you that the code isn't just protecting Marines, it's protecting itself. Centuries of words, metaphors, and traditions hidden inside the static of war. What was once a language scorned, beaten out of children in schools, now carries divisions across oceans. You feel the strange irony again. Here, the future of the Pacific Campaign rests on syllables that U.S. teachers once tried to erase. The surf beats its endless rhythm against the shore. The radios crackle softly in the dark, and you realize you're listening to something far older than war, older than nations, the heartbeat of a language that refuses to die. By now, you've been through enough battles to know the rhythm of a campaign, the thunder of the first bombardment, the chaotic scramble onto a beach, the grinding days of jungle combat that follow. But on Iwo Jima, that rhythm turns into something else entirely. The black volcanic sand seems to swallow men whole, the air itself thick with sulfur and smoke. This island, scarred and unforgiving, is where the Navajo Code Talkers carve their place into history. You crouch in a foxhole near the base of Mount Suribachi, the air vibrating with the roar of naval guns and the shriek of mortars. Marines dash across open sand, dropping left and right under machine gun fire. Radios crackle, words fly. But in the middle of it all, the Navajo Code Talkers sound almost calm, voices steady, syllables quick, like a drummer keeping the beat for a battle symphony. Here's your solid fact. In the first 2 days of the Iwo Jima invasion, Code Talkers sent hundreds of messages, all without a single error. Marine commanders were stunned. Without their quickness and accuracy, Major Howard Connor later said, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. That's not exaggeration. It's testimony from a man who depended on their voices every hour of those brutal days. And here's the lighter edge. Some Marines joked that the Japanese must have thought the Americans had hired ghosts. No matter how fast the enemy repositioned, artillery found them. No matter how carefully they tried to reinforce a bunker, demolition teams arrived with flamethrowers and explosives. They're reading our minds, one Japanese officer is reported to have said. He wasn't entirely wrong. What he was hearing was Navajo, slipping through the static faster than any codebreaker could hope to follow. You're kneeling in the sand when a shell whistles overhead and explodes just yards away, showering the foxhole with grit. A code talker beside you doesn't even flinch. He wipes the dust from his radio, presses his lips close to the mic, and lets the Navajo words fly. His partner, hidden in another trench, translates instantly, relays coordinates, and moments later Marine artillery answers back with devastating precision. The island shakes, smoke rises, and the balance tilts 1 inch closer toward victory. At night, huddled in dugouts carved into the volcanic rock, you hear them practicing. Even after 16 hours of combat, they test each other on the word for tank, for fighter plane, for battleship. Turtle, one whispers. Chicken hawk. Another answers. The words are alive, sharp, exact. You realize they are rehearsing survival, not just their own, but the entire division's. The Marines around them notice too. "I'd follow those guys anywhere," a corporal says, chewing on a ration bar. There's a respect in his voice that goes beyond admiration. It's something closer to awe. These men, once treated as outsiders in their own homeland, now hold the power to shape the course of battles. But there's irony here, too. Back home, many of their families still live under government pressure, land taken, schools forcing children to speak only English, traditions suppressed, and yet here, on this forsaken island, the U.S. military leans on their language as if it were the last bridge across an abyss. The days grind on, the mountain looming, and finally comes the moment seared into memory. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi. You see it from below, the cloth unfurling against the sky, the battlefield erupting in cheers. Amid the celebration, a code talker is hunched over his radio, sending out the message to command. His words, quick, clipped, steady, carry the news of triumph across miles of ocean in a language the enemy will never decode, and in that instant, you understand something. This victory is not just a Marine victory, not just an American victory. It's a Navajo victory too, one spoken in syllables older than the nation itself. The guns never truly fall silent on Iwo Jima, but in the rare pauses, when the smoke clears and the stars appear faintly through drifting ash, you hear the faint hum of the radios. The code talkers are still speaking, still guarding the fragile line between chaos and survival, and somewhere deep inside, you sense the weight of what they're carrying. Not just messages, not just codes, but a language, battered, threatened, nearly erased, that now roars across the Pacific, undefeated. The war pushes on, and with each island taken, the code grows more indispensable. By 1945, you've marched across volcanic sand, waded through mangrove swamps, and now find yourself staring at the shoreline of Okinawa. This is the last, most desperate struggle before Japan itself, and the code talkers are everywhere. Radios crackle in caves, on ridge lines, in muddy foxholes dug into fields of sugar cane. You crouch near a command post, a makeshift shelter half buried under sandbags and logs. Officers hunch over maps by lantern light, sweat glistening on their brows. Outside, artillery shells burst in the rain, turning the ground into rivers of mud. In the middle of the command post sits a young Navajo code talker, with headphones clamped tight over his ears. He listens, translates, rattles off messages in English to a lieutenant who scribbles them down with shaking hands. Then, almost without pause, the talker grips the mic and sends new instructions back out into the storm in Navajo, syllables sharp, fast, cutting through the static like a blade. Fact, on Okinawa alone, code talkers sent and received more than 800 messages, often under fire and always without error. Accuracy wasn't a luxury here, it was survival. Battles turned on seconds. If the code failed, Men died, but it didn't fail. Not once. And yet, humour still found its place amid the carnage. Marines joked that the code talkers never seemed to panic. "Maybe it's the desert blood in them," one private quipped, watching a Navajo calmly relay coordinates while mortar shells whistled overhead. Another story tells of a code talker who was so unfazed by shell fire that he paused to light a cigarette before finishing his transmission. "If the shells haven't killed me yet, this cigarette won't either," he reportedly said. Deadpan. It became a running joke among the unit. Smoke fast, talk faster. But behind the gallows humour lies a deeper truth. The Navajo men carried a double burden. Not only the weight of war, but the weight of secrecy. They knew, even then, that their role had to remain hidden. They could never tell their families what they were doing. Letters home were censored, words clipped. Imagine it. You're sending life or death messages every hour. But when you write to your parents, you can only say, "I am safe. I hope you are too." Nothing more. Sometimes, in the lull before dawn, you watch them talk quietly to one another, slipping back into Navajo outside of code. They tell stories from home, about sheep herding in the mesas, about the scent of juniper after a storm, about the laughter of sisters and brothers. For a moment, their eyes soften. Then the next order comes down, and their voices turn sharp again, transmitting the language of war disguised in the language of ancestors. The Japanese, desperate and cornered, throw everything they have at Okinawa: kamikaze pilots, artillery barrages, fanatical last stands. But their intelligence officers remain in the dark. Reports from captured soldiers admit frustration. The enemy speaks in a tongue we cannot follow. They're left blind, while American units move with uncanny speed. The Navajo voices are the invisible threads pulling the battle together, keeping chaos from unraveling the front. By June, Okinawa falls. It's a bitter victory. Tens of thousands dead. The island scarred beyond recognition. The men are gaunt, exhausted, their uniforms little more than rags. But in the quiet after the guns, one thing is clear. The code talkers have carried the war nearly to its end. Without them, the invasion of Japan would have been unthinkable. And then, suddenly, it is over. August 1945. 2 bombs fall and the war slams to a halt. You're in a tent hospital when the news spreads. Men stagger outside, blinking into the sunlight, uncertain whether to cheer or cry. A code talker stands silently in the doorway, his radio finally quiet. For the first time in years, he has no message to send. But even in peace, his silence is bound by secrecy. The program remains classified. The world will know of Normandy, of Iwo Jima, of Okinawa, but not of him. Not yet. He packs up his gear, boards a ship, and sails home across the Pacific. His war is over, but his story is still hidden. You watch him step onto the dock, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. No parades wait, no banners, no brass bands. Just his family, their faces worn with worry, waiting to embrace a son who cannot explain where he's been or what he's done. He smiles, hugs them tight, and says only what he's allowed. "I did my duty." And somewhere inside, he carries the unspoken knowledge that his duty was more than anyone around him could imagine. Peace has arrived, but it does not arrive gently. For many veterans, the return home feels like waking from a fever dream. You expect the guns to sound again at any moment. For the Navajo Code Talkers, it is even stranger. They step from the battlefield into a silence thick with secrets. The U.S. government classifies their code as top secret, No one is allowed to know the extent of their role, not even their families. Imagine it. You've spent years carrying radios up ridgelines, shouting into microphones while bullets cracked overhead, relaying messages that kept entire divisions alive, and then, in the afterglow of victory, you're told, say nothing. And so they don't. Not a word. Some come home to the dry mesas of Arizona, others to quiet hogans tucked between sandstone cliffs. Neighbors welcome them as veterans, but not as heroes. Mothers and fathers ask what they did in the war, and the young men answer with a shrug. Just a radio operator. Fact. The Code Talkers were ordered to remain silent about their role until 1968, over 2 decades after the war ended. By then, many had already lived half their lives without acknowledgement. The irony was cruel. While newspapers printed stories of generals and admirals, the men who had made those victories possible were herding sheep again, or working railroad jobs, or fixing cars in dusty garages. They wore the same silence they had carried on the battlefield, but now it was heavier. Some suffered the same scars as other veterans. Nights broken by nightmares of artillery fire, jumps at sudden noises, long silences at kitchen tables, but they had fewer outlets, fewer support systems. When they tried to explain their burdens to loved ones, words failed. After all, how do you describe a secret you're forbidden to speak? And yet, life continued. Children were born. Families grew. Many of the Code Talkers returned to the traditions of their people. Ceremonies were held to cleanse them of the darkness of war. The chants rose again in hogans, smoke from cedar fires curling into the starry sky. These ceremonies were not just rituals, they were survival. They stitched the men back into the fabric of their culture, where healing was found not in medals or speeches, but in songs that had been sung for centuries. There were moments of quiet pride, even if unspoken. A Code Talker might overhear on the radio that Iwo Jima was remembered as one of the hardest fought battles in marine history. He would nod slightly, recalling the 800 messages he had transmitted there without a single error, but he said nothing. The silence grew heavier still as the years passed. Some men died before they could tell their families the truth. Sons and daughters would later say, "We never knew. He never talked about the war." The irony deepened. In school, Navajo children were still punished for speaking their language. Teachers wrapped rulers across small knuckles, washed mouths out with soap, demanded silence. The very words that had carried American victory across the Pacific were forbidden in classrooms in Arizona and New Mexico. Parents who had bled for their country watched as their children were shamed for speaking the same syllables. Imagine the sting of that contradiction. It was like winning a war with a song, only to have the song banned at home. And yet, the Code Talkers did not break. Silence became their companion. Some turned their energy toward community work, helping their people navigate the hardships of poverty, racism, and change. Others sought refuge in the wide open spaces of the reservation, where the wind hummed through sandstone canyons and the sheep grazed unbothered, as they had for centuries. At reunions with fellow Marines, sometimes the Code Talkers were asked again about their role. They would shrug, laugh lightly, and change the subject. The truth remained locked away, waiting for a day that seemed like it might never come. Decades slipped by. The world moved on to new wars, new secrets, new technologies. The radios they once carried, heavy and buzzing, became relics. Their language remained vibrant, but it lived under pressure, caught between ridicule and resilience. And still, the silence endured, until one day, over 20 years later, the seal of secrecy was finally broken. The order came down from Washington. the story could be told. The Navajo Code Talkers were no longer ghosts in the war record, but by then, time had already taken its toll. The official recognition came in the late 1960s. The government at last admitted what had been hidden, that Navajo voices had carried messages no enemy could crack, that these young men had been as vital to victory as tanks or planes. Yet the announcement was quiet, almost perfunctory, like a bureaucratic afterthought. Imagine hearing that the secret you carried through decades of silence is now public, but with no parade, no grand speech, no medals in the mail, just a footnote in military history, mentioned here and there in articles and reports. For the Code Talkers, it was a strange release. Some finally spoke, telling children and grandchildren what they had done. Others, after so long, found they had no words left. Silence had become too natural. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that the world began to truly listen. Documentaries were filmed. Books were written. Veterans organizations invited Code Talkers to speak at schools and universities. For the first time, their role entered public consciousness. Classrooms that once punished Navajo words now invited them in as lessons, history, and pride. And then came the medals. In 2001, President George W. Bush awarded the original 29 Code Talkers the Congressional Gold Medal, with silver medals for the hundreds of others who had followed. By then, many had already passed away. Their children or grandchildren accepted the medals in their stead, holding the heavy coins in calloused hands, their surfaces shining with recognition long overdue. It was bittersweet. Pride surged, but so did the ache of waiting too long. Some families said, "He would have been so happy to see this." Others admitted, "He never talked about it. We had no idea until now." Still, the honor mattered. For once, the Navajo language was spoken into microphones not as an obstacle or a curiosity, but as a living treasure. Veterans stood in suits and traditional jewelry alike, turquoise stones glinting beneath the lights, their voices carrying across halls in Washington. Dios sec. The same voices that had carried enemy machine guns ahead and send reinforcements now across Iwo Jima were now carrying songs of remembrance and pride, but recognition did not erase the contradictions. Many of the Code Talkers returned from war to reservations still scarred by poverty. Some had lost years to alcohol, others to the weight of trauma. For every medal ceremony, there were still elders living in homes without running water, still communities struggling for basic dignity, and yet there was resilience at powwows, schools, and memorials. Children learned to say, with clear voices, that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had saved lives with the strength of their language. Songs were sung, flags raised, and prayers spoken in both English and Navajo. It was a victory beyond the battlefield. The language once beaten down in schools had proven itself unbreakable, against the Empire of Japan, against the silence of secrecy, and against the slow erosion of time. Each recognition, each retelling of their story, was not just an honor for the men, but a shield for the words they had carried. And still, there is a whisper of sorrow. You picture a Code Talker, elderly now, sitting on his porch beneath the desert sky. He looks out over mesas painted gold by the setting sun, medals in a box nearby, the air warm with the scent of juniper. Recognition has come, yes, but it came late. His brothers are gone, his youth long behind him, and the echoes of the war never fully fade. The honor is real, the pride is lasting, as but so, too, is the quiet knowledge. History almost forgot them, and maybe, just maybe, That is why their story must be told in full, with no silence left unbroken. Now, in the quiet of reflection, you walk through the present-day Navajo Nation, where reminders of that story linger everywhere. Roads cross red earth and wind through canyons carved by time. Along them stand small memorials, stone markers etched with names of men who once spoke a code no one else could. Some towns host annual parades, others hold ceremonies each Veterans Day, where children wave flags and elders drum. You notice the pride is not loud, it is steady, like the heartbeat of a drum circle. A school teacher in Window Rock explains to her class that the Navajo language is powerful because it carried secrets the world could not steal. She writes on the board words like turtle for tank, chicken hawk for dive bomber, and the children repeat them, giggling, yet aware that what they speak is history woven into syllables. At the Navajo Nation Museum, a display case holds one of the radios carried in the Pacific. It looks heavy, unwieldy, scarred by rust and salt. Beside it sits a photograph. Two young men in uniforms, eyes squinting against the tropical sun. They look ordinary, but they carried extraordinary weight. Visitors stop, lean in, and whisper their amazement. A plaque beneath the photo reads, "Their voices were their weapons," and across the nation, families retell their own stories. A granddaughter recalls how her grandfather, once stern and silent, softened when she asked him about the war. He told her, finally, how the radio weighed more than he did, how the jungle stank of rot, how his words moved faster than bullets. He said, "We saved lives because we could speak." She remembers the look in his eyes, half sorrow, half pride, as if he knew the truth was both a burden and a gift. Beyond the Navajo Nation, the world continues to honor them. Films, documentaries, and novels portray their story, sometimes with accuracy, sometimes not. Veterans groups in Japan and the U.S. alike have acknowledged their role, bowing heads in shared respect. At the National World War II Memorial in Washington, visitors leave flowers, feathers, and small tokens near their names, but perhaps the most meaningful tributes are the living ones. Today, language revitalization programs encourage Navajo youth to speak the tongue their ancestors nearly lost. Classes are taught in immersion, radio stations broadcast in Navajo, and families sing lullabies in the old words. The language is no longer hidden, no longer punished, no longer confined to secrecy. Instead, it flows openly again, a river returning to its course. And as you reflect on all this, you realize the Code Talkers gave more than victory in war. They gave a reason to hold on to language, a reminder that identity itself can be a shield. In the face of erasure, they turned survival into strategy. In the face of dismissal, they proved indispensability. Imagine, then, a classroom decades from now. A child reads from a textbook. The Navajo Code Talkers played a vital role in World War II. She pauses, looks up, and asks her teacher, "Do we still speak Navajo?" The teacher smiles and answers, "Yes, because of them." And outside that classroom the land stretches wide. The mesas, the canyons, the endless horizon. A wind moves through sagebrush, carrying with it words that once saved lives. Words that still live. Words that remind the world of a time when silence could have erased everything. But silence did not win. The voices did. Night has settled now, both in your imagination and in the story. You sit quietly, letting the weight of history ease into a softer rhythm, like embers glowing low after a long fire. The tale of the Navajo Code Talkers has carried you from battlefields drenched in rain and gunpowder to classrooms where children laugh as they recite once